It all begins with this hyperactive half-border collie, Ruby. She is seen running through the woods, with Pat, an advocate at the dog shelter, looking for her. She keeps calling out to Ruby, but Ruby doesn't listen, so she lures Ruby with her favorite treat, hot dog. Pat takes Ruby back to the shelter, her stench from her encounter with a skunk oozing all over the place. Rick, her colleague, then informs her that they have skunk soap. He also reminds her that a new family will be coming to adopt her soon, so she needs to be presentable. But Pat tells him that Ruby doesn't want to leave them. However, Rick quickly corrects the notion that Ruby doesn't want to leave her, as she is too attached to the dog. Well, Pat could take her home, but her husband doesn't seem to be on board with the idea. While Pat is giving Ruby a bath, she reveals that Ruby has previously been adopted 7 times already, over the last 6 months, but was always returned to the shelter due to the family's inability to control or train her. But Ruby is so damn happy with the shelter that she doesn't even care. Meanwhile, there's Rhode Island State Trooper Daniel O'Neill polishing his shoes and getting ready for work. After that, he grabs his keys and joins his wife Melissa and their little boy upstairs. After eating, he does the dishes and then kisses his wife goodbye before leaving the house. While driving to work, he stops by the beach to admire the canine search and rescue team. He meets Seamus Brady, a retired maintenance worker from Situate Barracks, who tells him that they're searching for drugs that were tossed out of a vehicle the night before. The two hit it off as Brady realizes Dan's interest in the canine unit and his profound knowledge about search and rescue dogs. While they're talking, Dan wishes he could be one of the teammates with a great dog as well. But before Brady can say another word, Dan realizes he's running late and has to leave immediately. He gets to the office and joins an ongoing meeting, with the sergeant mentioning the upcoming Canine Academy tryouts, which they're rooting for Dan to try out for the 8th time. Yep, he has dreamed of joining the canine search and rescue team all his life, but he's been rejected 7 times. Who knows? 8th time's a charm, right? Well, it's going to take more than a miracle to get Dan where he wants to be, because this is actually his last chance to qualify before he turns 30. Yep, all applicants must be under 30. After the meeting, Dan approaches the sergeant and reminds her that it's his last year to try out. She agrees to write him a letter of recommendation, but reminds him that she's not the one standing between him and his tryout, but Zarella, his canine unit, and his academy. Back at the shelter, Ruby's new family comes to pick her up, but Ruby refuses to go with them. After much persuasion and effort, she finally follows them. Rick then informs Pat that if this family returns her, then he'd have no choice but to put Ruby out. Meanwhile, Dan tries to get through his busy day of issuing speed tickets and helping the neighborhood. At the end of the day, he goes to see Sergeant Zarella to prove to him that he's wary about the tryouts not because of his skills, but his passion for justice and saving human lives. However, Zarella breaks it to Dan that the department no longer has funds for new dogs, as the German Shepherds now cost $10,000 each. Those are the breeds commonly used for the search and rescue program, but this year they won't be joining the program. He then concludes by sharing his experience with Dan and how he had to work twice as hard to get to where he is. Dan then tells him that he is used to working 10 times as hard and thanks him before leaving. Outside the office, Dan calls his wife to tell him about the cost of the German Shepherds, but she tells him that they don't have that much money to waste, as they now have their hands full. She then breaks it to him that she's pregnant with their 2nd child, and Dan just can't contain his happiness anymore. Now, he's even more determined to go for the canine unit, as the promotion will improve his pay and benefits and let them live a comfortable life. Meanwhile, at the shelter, Ruby is returned once again on account that she doesn't listen. She's too high-strung. She steals food, doesn't sleep at night, and the complaint continues. Pat tries to suggest linking him to people who train dogs, but he refuses and asks for a cat instead. Later, when Rick arrives at work, He tells Pat that they can't keep unadoptable dogs and that she will be put down tonight. Pat asks him to give her more time, as she will take a lot of time to realize that the shelter isn't her home. But Rick isn't having it anymore. Pat then asks for one more day, and that she still has a few people she can call. She spends the whole afternoon calling people to ask if they could use a new dog, but all reject the offer. Pat then calls her husband to ask if they could adopt Ruby, but they already seem to have their hands full with 2 reptiles, a spider, 2 noisy dogs, and 4 kids. No wonder he declined before. Back at the office, Dan steps out the back to watch the K9 unit in training when he meets Brady again. He then asks Brady if he knows anyone giving out a German Shepherd for free, as he would need one to try out for the team. Brady then lets him in a secret. He doesn't technically need a German Shepherd to apply. Rather, he needs a young, good-sized dog who's curious, agile, and spirited. And of course, it doesn't cost as much as $10,000. After work, Dan visits the shelter, where Pat, whose prayers have been answered, convinces Dan to adopt Ruby and train her to join the program. They then head outside, where Dan does a fetch test with Ruby. This goes well, and Dan immediately picks an interest in this overly energetic K9. Afterwards, he goes to sign the papers, during which Rick tries to discourage him by telling Dan about Ruby's past. But Dan's mind is made up as he concludes that what he sees is what he gets. In fact, he believes that Ruby is going to be the first shelter dog to make the K9 unit. Being convinced, Rick finally comes to terms with the fact that Ruby might have just gotten the so-called home they've been looking for. After making payments, Dan is given some food, a food bowl, and a dog bed. And for the first time, Ruby willingly follows someone out of the shelter. That night, Dan returns home with Ruby, whose first reaction is to run into the house and leave a present on the bedroom floor for Mel, who isn't pleased with the idea of having a dog. The trouble is only getting started as Ruby fails to listen, destroys stuff, and even bothers Mel when she's trying to work. On Ruby's second night, Dan tries to get her to sleep in her own bed, but Ruby says otherwise. Mel is displeased in so many ways, so she tells Dan to take the bonding outside. Left with no choice, Dan takes Ruby and her bed outside. He spreads a blanket and invites Ruby to join him while Mel watches them from the window in disbelief. And we know how it goes from here. Dan tries to train Ruby, but she's just impossible. He almost gives up on her but builds his confidence back when Brady asks him who would believe in her if he doesn't. So he decides to give it another try, this time with Mel's full support, after realizing that Ruby is part of the family now. It turns out that both Dan and Ruby are alike. They both are high-energy enthusiastic and have to discover how to work together effectively. Through the next few days, Dan spends his time training Ruby. One day at work, Ruby is caught stealing on camera from the Sarge, who reports to Dan. As punishment, Dan locks Ruby up in a cage outside the office. As Ruby begins to protest by barking, Dan pleads with her to be the solution, not the problem, causing Ruby to quiet down and stay still. Meanwhile, Zarella has been watching Dan, and I'd say it's too early to declare what he thinks right now. Sometime later, Dan decides to watch some online video that could help him in training Ruby. He finds a channel that teaches dogs by using clicker and reward methods, but it still doesn't work on Ruby. When Mel comes downstairs, he tells her that nothing is working, so she suggests that he change the reward he uses for Ruby. The following day, Dan goes to the shelter, with Rick thinking he has come to return Ruby as usual. But Dan has only come to ask for advice on how to train her. Then it occurs to Pat. How could she have forgotten that Ruby would do anything for a hot dog? With that, Dan thanks them and leaves. With the K9 tryouts coming closer, Dan intensifies the training, offering Ruby her favorite treat as they go running, and as Ruby learns to sit on command, stay and fetch without running away with something else. He assures Mel that he's ready for the tryout. But later at night, he can't help but toss and turn, worried that Ruby might flop everything. He heads downstairs to brush his hat and play with Ruby when Mel joins them. Mel, seeing how nervous Dan is, then tells him that she has faith in him and that he just needs to have faith in himself. Morning comes, and all participants have gathered, waiting for Sergeant Zarella. He soon arrives and welcomes Ruby, the newest member, to the tryouts. Afterwards, he asks the owners to keep the dogs in a pen as he would need to see them briefly. Inside, Sergeant Zarella explains that they're not trying out for the K-9 unit, but for his class. He mentions that after an entry exam, those accepted do 6 weeks of intensive training. For the final advice to qualify, he states that the dog and the owner must have the right temperament, focus, calmness, and special compassion. After the brief address, they head back to the field, where the test begins. Every other dog does excellently well, including Ruby. The sergeant also does a stay-put test on them, which Ruby passes wonderfully. Well, at least until the drive and good nose test, where she gets impatient and runs off. The sergeant then orders that the rest chase after Ruby as their first search assignment. Meanwhile, Ruby somehow finds a bee's nest, causing everyone to retreat, and Dan to get bitten trying to save her. Later that night, Dan apologizes to Mel, saying that he wanted this for them, but things aren't working as he planned. Mel then reminds him of how he got through the police academy with dyslexia and hyperactivity, but he's not willing to try as he believes that he might be able to push himself to his full potential, but not Ruby. The next day, Mel comes home from grocery shopping with the idea of homeschooling Ruby. Wonderful idea it is as Dan rushes to retrieve the training manual he had thrown away. He returns to the kitchen and tells Mel he'll have to use up his vacation days to train Ruby starting tomorrow. However, he realizes there might not be time to read the manual as an audiobook would be better, but Mel offers to be his audiobook instead. As the official exams are coming up, he prepares a training course with Mel's help and trains Ruby on how to search. He also gets help from the others from the academy. Finally, after 6 weeks, Dan returns to the academy with Ruby for the exam. Zarella announces that each team will be asked to look for 3 things: a cell phone, a firearm, and human remains. He calls up a different team first, but Dan asks if they could go first. As they begin the first course, Ruby finds the cell phone and the firearm in less than 2 minutes. And for the last and most difficult test, Ruby would have to find human remains inside the building. Ruby is left to explore the entire building in search of the remains. She sniffs her way through every single room she can find and ultimately finds nothing. After reporting to Dan, Zarella asks what their final answer is. Dan tells him that if Ruby says it's not there, then there's actually nothing there. And with that, Zarella breaks the good news to the duo that they have succeeded in record time. He reveals that the search was a negative one, as sometimes they might be sent for things that might not be in the location they were asked to search. Dan carries Ruby and rushes out, announcing that they passed, and it turns out that a lot of people were rooting for Ruby to pass. Afterwards, Zarella finally recruits Dan and Ruby into his junior team. Months pass, and Dan is getting impatient with the fact that he and Ruby have not been needed for the main cases of search and rescue. Finally, one night, Dan receives a call to find a murder victim who's meant to be in the house but isn't. He takes Ruby with him, and they arrive at the crime scene, where Ruby immediately begins to search for the body. After sniffing the entire house clean, Ruby stops at the front deck barking, but after searching, Dan and the officer don't find the body. The officer then urges Dan to call for professionals, and Dan loses his cool with Ruby. He takes her back to the car and blames her for blowing it all up. At home, he takes off everything from pictures to manuals and books and starts throwing them out. And as always, Mel is there to strengthen him and reassure him that everything will be fine. After she leaves, Ruby tries to make contact with Dan, but he ignores her and leaves the room. Later that night, Ruby, who's feeling dejected, runs away. The next morning, Dan realizes that Ruby has gone missing after putting out food for her and is unable to find her. He rushes to get dressed and heads out to find Ruby. While he's out looking for Ruby, he gets a call from Zarella, who breaks it to him that Ruby was right about the body's location. It was actually buried under the deck, covered in 3 inches of cement. He mentions that it's indeed a miracle that Ruby caught the scent and that he should have trusted his canine. Disappointed in himself, Dan continues to search for Ruby. Meanwhile, Mel prints out missing posters and begins to go from door to ask if anyone has seen Ruby. The neighbors also help out, but Ruby is nowhere to be found. Dan even goes to the shelter to ask if Ruby came back there by any chance, but she didn't. As he returns to his car, it starts to rain. Zarella then calls him, saying that there's a missing boy and that he and Ruby are expected to join the unit at an address he'll be sending. Dan then tells him that Ruby ran away, and Zarella answers that by reminding him that he's not at K9 without a partner. After searching everywhere for Ruby, she finally brings herself to Dan. As they unite, Dan apologizes to her and tells her it's time to go home. But Ruby wants to search for the boy instead, so Dan decides they head to the location. Dan and Ruby arrive at the location late at night and join the search teams seeking Michael, a boy who got lost while hiking. Ruby finally finds him in the rain and dark, but they're unable to reach out to the others about their location. Ruby then climbs up and starts to bark, drawing Zarella and the medics to their location. After everything, it turns out that the boy who went missing was Pat's son. Pat thanks Dan and Ruby, and Dan is finally promoted to an official K9 officer. And this is the end. This was a recap of the 2022 movie Rescued by Ruby, directed by Kat Shee. The film stars Grant Gustin and is based on a true story about a man named Daniel O'Neill and his wonderful K9 Ruby. Today, both of them continue to serve the Rhode Island State Police Force, being partners for 10 years now. What's your take on this heartwarming movie? Let us know in the comments below with #CineMeerkat.